Your Town Matters is funded by the Government of Canada through the Local Journalism Initiative and supported by Cactus Media, Canada's independent community television association.
I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Your Town Matters. I'm joined today by Senior Planner for the Southwest New Brunswick Service Commission, Xander Gopen, to talk about housing in Southwest New Brunswick. Thanks so much for joining me today, Xander.
Oh, you're welcome, Vicki. It's great to be here.
So you released new data, and this is an update to what was a 91-page housing report that first came out 2020. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you've learned in this update to that was just released this month, and also maybe for people who are not familiar with what the report was originally, what were the key findings that you found for the communities around Southwest New Brunswick?
Sure. So I'll actually go back to before 2020 to 1996. And that's when there was a study done. I think some industry groups had come together in the region, and they could sort of see that they were starting to have employment issues, and they worked with a professor from Mount Allison University to do a housing study for the municipalities in the region. It probably wasn't doing Macadam or Harvey, but certainly the coastal ones. And believe it or not, in 1996 there was not enough housing here, especially rental housing. So this is not new news, but that study really didn't seem to lead to anything, and it was kind of a footnote to a lot of the regional planning that had happened here around transportation, a lot of stuff that has come out of our office and other places. So there was, in 2020 and in 2019, people were having these conversations again and saying, it seems like there's, it's hard for employers to find places for employees to live. For example, in St. Andrews, I think Kingsbrae Gardens bought what's now called the Annex. That was in 2019, I believe they did that, or maybe it was the summer of 2020. So summer of 2019. It was definitely pre-pandemic. So there was already, people had realized it was a problem in 1996. Nothing had really happened. It's probably still a problem in 2020. So a group of people in the community, including those of us at the Southwest New Brunswick Service Commission, as well as some folks from Vibrant Community Charlotte County, Horizon Health Community Developers, and I believe there was somebody from ONB at the time, but that sort of shifted. There was a housing working group, and we all felt like we needed to know what was really going on. And one of the issues for rural communities, and especially small municipalities in general, is it's hard to find data. There's, the census is really great. It provides a ton of usable data, but it only happens every 5 years. And when it gets into details like average market rents, vacancy rates, things that are very important to understand the housing market, that they won't even give data for municipalities under 5,000. So in Charlotte County, that's basically everywhere, except maybe St. Stephen, but then there's still quality issues, and so you don't get very much. So if we want to know what the situation is, it's not like we can just go online and find some data and say, here's what it is. We actually had to find the data, really create the data ourselves by calling landlords. That's really how we found out what people were charging for rent and how many vacant units they had. So we did that, and we basically confirmed in 2020 what we knew anecdotally and what had been found in 1996, that there's not enough of the right types of housing in every municipality, basically. And oftentimes the right type of housing is something that's affordable. It's something that's the right amount of space, so it's not too big, it's not too small, and it's in good condition. So you don't have to make major repairs. There isn't, for example, bad mold that causes health problems. So we found that, yeah, this is a problem everywhere. Slightly different flavors in different communities, but extremely low vacancy rates. In places where there were higher vacancy rates, you would have very high proportions of places that were unsuitable, so they weren't in good enough condition, basically, or they needed serious repairs. So there are problems everywhere, and unlike 1996, we really wanted to make sure that people knew about this study. So I spoke with one of your colleagues here about it, and other media outlets as well, and made sure to talk to the municipalities about it, keep it kind of front of mind, and there was some movement on it, and we did see some for example, some nonprofits say, hey, we should really be doing more housing work, and there's some things underway, but we I guess in fall of 2021, the municipality of St. Stephen heard about a grant through CMHC to basically come up with solutions for housing challenges. And we applied for that and were successful in getting it. And that grant allowed us to update the studies we did in 2020, and we could pay some people to do it instead of doing it ourselves. So I didn't have to call landlords anymore. Really, our junior planner, Vivian, didn't have to call landlords anymore because she did most of that. And Turner, Drake and Partners, they're an economic firm that's based out of Halifax, but they do work across the country, and recently they've been focusing on affordable housing. So they did the market update, and the St. John Human Development Council, obviously based in St. John, they are a social science research organization, and they've done great work already in our region around health needs. And so we were able to partner with them to do a deeper dive into some qualitative aspects of data, so really hearing stories from people about what their lived experiences were like. So that's the new data we have, and unsurprisingly, if you've been paying attention to housing in our region, there's not a lot of good news. The vacancy rates have changed a little bit. In some cases they've gone up, in some cases they've gone down. They're still too low everywhere. There still isn't enough of the right types of housing, and what's really changed in the last 2 years is the cost of homeownership has really gone up. So one of the, I guess you could say, blessings of being in an area that didn't have a huge amount of development pressure and a lot of people moving here is that historically it was relatively cheap to buy a home in most of our municipalities, with St. Andrews maybe being a bit of an exception, or at least being on the upper end of the Charlotte County market. And just looking at my notes here, in the last 5 years, in every municipality, the cost of home ownership has gone up at least 40%. Some are 60%, and some are higher than 100%. So in some communities, the cost of home ownership has doubled in the last 5 years, and in some cases in 2 years it's gone up a lot, and incomes have not gone up at that rate. So that's new data that we have from the census, just came out last week. It's averaged across a population, but for individuals and households, income has gone up at most 20% in that same 5-year period. So people were already struggling, and it used to be that a lot of people in Charlotte County had an easier time getting into the homeownership market. So the need for the rental market was there, but not as great. And now, really in the last 2 years, but 5 years as well, that has changed exponentially. And so you have, it's hard to say an actual percentage of people, but there's probably 10 to 20% of people who historically would have been able to afford a home here, and now they can't, so they're going to need rental housing if there isn't a major change to the home ownership market.
Wow. Yeah, the data definitely paints a picture of a housing crisis for the region, and I know that data is actually really important. I think people take it for granted in a bigger city. There's a lot of people compiling data, but when you're in a rural area, sometimes it just doesn't exist, but you need that data to apply for grants, for developers to make a case for a partnership and whatnot. And also to just give the community an idea of what's really going on. Would you say the last 2 years with the pandemic, I know we've celebrated this silver lining that people have discovered New Brunswick, but that also has created more of a critical need in the housing area. Why should someone care, though, who has a home? What picture do you paint for them of the ripple effect when there isn't enough, especially affordable housing in an area? I think anyone who is an employer feels that, but maybe if you're just comfortable, you have your place, be it something you own or rent, that's just definitely yours. You're not as worried, but it definitely does affect all of our lives.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to see sometimes the way it does, and I think one of the things I always keep in the back of my mind is what happens to societies when people's basic needs aren't met. And historically, you can look at the past and see what happens, especially on large scales when people's needs aren't met. And housing is a basic need. It's food, shelter, and clothing is what the cliche is, and probably food and shelter are the most important there. So big long picture, I think that's the reason people should care, is just because of what happens when people's basic needs aren't met. But on a more local and probably more short-term scale, I think it's hard to pin direct causation, but a lot of the shifts and impacts to the labor market that we've seen in the last 2 years, housing is a part of that. It's hard to say, I hate picking on the pier, but they seem to be the place I pick on a lot in this case.
Okay.
I haven't driven past today. I don't know if they're open yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Apparently end of this month.
End
That's
of
a
this
restaurant
month.
in St. Andrews for people who aren't familiar with the area. And we've seen that a lot. I can use St. Andrews as an example right now of different businesses that are closed a couple days a week this summer, despite demand being high. There just isn't staff. And, there is that element of the pandemic involved in that too, where everyone's had to make for cases of COVID and outbreaks in different areas. But definitely there just isn't enough staff. There's been a help wanted sign, as you said, on the pier since, I think, May.
Yeah. And, it's interesting to see that sort of longer established businesses, places that I've gone, again and again and seen like it's the same servers there again and again, they probably are secure in their housing here. And so that might be one of the reasons why those more established businesses with people that they, employ and have employed for a long time and have been a part of the community for a long time, they're not struggling quite so much.
So what would be a healthy, and I know this is hard to, you were at I'm trying to think if it was St. George Council meeting or a Blacks Harbor Council meeting where we were looking at vacancy rates. So in a bigger urban center, a healthy vacancy rate could, maybe, is it 5%? Is that
3 to 5% is typically the range that is considered healthy. And the idea with that is, and a vacancy rate is for people who aren't familiar with the term, it's basically the percentage of vacant units in a market at any given time. And if you have too low of a vacancy rate, there is not going to be any choice in that market. So, there's a variety of types of units you'll find in a rental market, everything from a single room to a whole house and, bachelor, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom. Without a healthy vacancy rate, you're going to limit that number of options, and then price, that fluctuates. condition that fluctuates. So when you have a vacancy rate that's too low, basically there isn't enough choice in the market, and like any economic good, when demand is high and supply is low, price usually goes up.
Okay.
Now on the flip side, when we have a really high vacancy rate, that probably means there isn't much demand in a market, and that might mean it's harder to keep up with repairs, because the landlord might not be getting enough revenue coming in for that unit, because there's nobody living in it. So that's the flip side of a high vacancy rate. We really don't have problems with high vacancy rates down here.
Okay. What about the topic of affordable housing? Because that's obviously relative and up for interpretation at times. But is there a healthy way to look at what a definition of that is? And is it hard to attract a developer in a rural area to do something that's affordable?
Yes, that's easy. It's easy to answer that question. It's harder to answer the question of what is affordable, because affordable is going to mean very different things to different people. And I think what affordable has come to mean today when people say it is something that isn't, it's not social housing. It's not completely subsidized by the province. It's not, so it's going to be something that's on the market. But it's something that probably has a little bit of support from some level of government in some way. That doesn't exactly answer the question of how much is it going to cost, because affordability is dependent on incomes. Mm-hmm. So there are criteria that are used to define affordable housing by groups like CMHC, and they would say, although I've noticed it started to change, what they'll use for affordability, 30% of an area's median income, median household income. The idea being that people should be spending about 30% of their before tax income on housing. If you research where that comes from, somebody just said it once and it kind of stuck. Back in the 70s, some researcher in the United States. And because affordability is so variable, depends on cost of living, depends on incomes, it is one of these things that's really hard to define, and you do just sort of have to pick a number and go with it. Another thing that's used by CMHC is 80% of median market rent for an area. So you're going to have to figure out what the median market rent is. So again, you get back to the importance of data, and one of the challenges of not having data is if you can't say what that is, you can't say what affordable is. But even those metrics, I think, are probably leaving people behind, and there's still a gap between folks who are going to, and it's not perfect, the social support systems we have for people with really great needs are not perfect by any means, but there's a point at which you end up in that bucket, so to speak, and that's getting bigger. And I think that's what's concerning myself and a lot of other housing advocates, is that you have more people needing more and more support, and it's actually very expensive, to provide that level of support for people who, if they actually had adequate shelter, might not need as much support. It's very expensive. So it actually costs a lot of money to have the situation we're in on a long-term societal basis.
Is there a way to incentivize developers? Sometimes they obviously, it's great if they have ties to the area, they care more. I can think of a recent example being Trust of Bevington in the Blue Moon location that's been proposed as a 42 affordable housing unit. I know. Yeah,
I mean, I think affordable is, again, it's, and I've had this conversation with councils, and you've been there, you've heard it every time. Everybody says, well, how much is it going to cost? What's affordable? And a developer will always say, well, I can't tell you until we get to the end and I've actually spent the money on what it costs, especially now, because if a project takes 2 or 3 years, I would build in 20% contingency into that up front, assuming that the cost of labor and cost of materials is going to be a lot higher at the end of that. So it's I just want to caveat that by, I've talked with Tressa, and she's talked to a counselor, and she says she wants to make things as affordable as possible.
And she's looking for a partnership, I understand. So
Yeah.
that is a way to
That's
maybe...
a way to help things be more affordable, and I'm absolutely sure that it will be affordable to a lot of people, and they will be full. Like, I think from what I've seen, it's going to meet market needs absolutely. It just might not meet what some people think is the definition of affordable, but I don't want to make people think that's a bad thing in any ways, because there's a huge segment of market needs that are not being met. And that, in some cases, in St. Andrews, is actually luxury housing. Like, I wouldn't say it's as important of a need as truly affordable housing for, people are going to work at businesses in the summer. But there's a lot of seniors who would like to stay in St. Andrews, would like to retire, and are concerned about accessibility in their current homes, and would like a place to rent. And they might have a lot of disposable income to do that. But if that unit doesn't exist in St. Andrews, they won't be able to live in St. Andrews anymore.
So, I guess... Oh, continue your thoughts. Sorry.
I just interrupted you on the affordable question.
Well, I was going to pivot and say, what about something like ECW, if we're talking about nonprofits getting involved? That's another solution. In what ways can they play a pivotal role in shaping the future of housing?
Well, nonprofits, and it's interesting you use the term the future of housing, because when I think about the future of housing, it's such a cliche, but I look at the past of housing too. And if you look at the past of housing in Canada, the nonprofit sector and I would say the government sector has played a huge part in providing affordable housing. Historically, starting in the 50s, after the Second World War, the federal government, through CMHC, started building lots and lots of housing. That a lot of that became suburbs, and as an urban planner, I have issues with how those communities were designed and some of the effects we're dealing with today. But there was a lot of housing built, and it met people's needs, and they were able to get into housing. So I think that's interesting to look at that. But then as you move through history a little bit in more of the 70s and 80s, the federal government was still involved in building housing, but they were also partnering with lots and lots of nonprofits. And so you had the co-op housing movement, and really just the nonprofit housing sector came to exist. And there are examples in Charlotte County of some of these earlier forms of affordable housing. So the St. Croix Valley Housing Cooperative in St. Stephen, that's a housing cooperative, very, very affordable. I think they have a long waiting list today. And, they have, I think, about 20 units in St. Stephen, and it doesn't seem like they will be expanding anytime soon. Another longer-term player here is Charlotte County Housing, and they've done lots of work. They manage units in a lot of different municipalities. But again, it doesn't really seem like they're going to be developing anything new. So Eastern Charlotte Waterways, who you brought up, and Project Village, which is their kind of community development spinoff, they're a nonprofit, Eastern Charlotte Waterways, although I think now they're just ECW. They're doing the whole KFC thing. They started doing water testing. Like, you wanted to check your well water, you took it to ECW and you found out. And then they got into more, watershed monitoring, more kind of typical environmental nonprofit stuff. And then in 2020, I think because they saw a report, they realized somebody should be developing housing. We have some capacity. We don't have any experience with housing, but we're a nonprofit, so we have a board, we have accountants, we have lawyers, we have some of this infrastructure that you need to be a developer. And they were able to partner with the woman who runs it. Her name is Kit Hickey, out of St. John, Housing Alternative St. John, who, again, they have a long history in the co-op sector. They're a really interesting nonprofit, and they partnered to sort of help with some of the applications and CMHC grants and things like that. So they're now a lot closer to developing housing. They haven't actually developed it yet, but they've they have architects hired, they have site plans, they have a site in Blacks Harbor. So they're moving in that direction, and that's kind of really our biggest hope with this kind of work, is that it can provide some of that support, inspiration, conversation points, to inspire groups like ECW. I've had other conversations with other nonprofits in the area who are thinking about affordable housing. So that's one of the big hopes with this work, is to grow that nonprofit sector.
Well, I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but I do think the work that you've done, I notice it from just being at council and seeing presentations of projects that are underway. I can feel that it has influenced a lot of the work that's going on right now. So I'd love to have you back regularly so we can keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on, what needs are being met, and what needs aren't. Thank you so much, Xander.
You're welcome.
My guest today has been Xander Gopen, Senior Planner of the Southwest New Brunswick Service Commission. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Your Town Matters.